Hello, and welcome to the Talking Brains podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephanie Sarkis. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Today we'll be talking to Mark Bertin, MD, a developmental pediatrician. He studied at Cornell University and UCLA School of Medicine, and he did his training at Oakland's Children's Hospital, California. He is also an assistant professor of pediatrics at New York Medical College. Dr. Bertin has a private practice in Pleasantville, New York, and he also leads mindfulness classes. He has a few books out. He has books, The Family ADHD Solution and Mindful Parenting for ADHD. His latest book is How Children Thrive, The Practical Science of Raising Independent, Resilient, and Happy Kids. Dr. Bertin is also a fellow blogger at Huffington Post and Psychology Today. His website is developmentaldoctor.com. Enjoy the podcast. Hi, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Mark Bertin. Mark is a developmental pediatrician, and he's the author of How Children Thrive, The Practical Science of Raising Independent, Resilient, and Happy Kids. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast today, Mark.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie. Always good to talk to you.
And Mark and I have known each other for a while. We are both active with CHAD, the National ADHD Organization. That's how we met. I believe we met through Ari Tuckman, who was also a guest on the podcast talking about ADHD. So we're going to talk a little bit about Mark's book, because Mark's book, I not just because Mark's my friend, but I really think from reading this book, I think every parent should have a copy of this book. It answers a lot of questions that parents ask me, and I'm going to ask you, Mark, about self-care and the role of technology in kids' lives and in parents' lives. What can we expect from kids' brains? I have worked with people that are starting to potty train their kids a year and a half, and getting upset when their kids can't. So pushing kids, I think, to do sometimes what's beyond their ability. So we're going to talk a little bit about the executive function part of the brain, and also how that makes parenting challenging, but also can be kind of fun too. So first, Mark, I want to ask you a little bit about the importance of parents knowing kids' milestones.
Well, yeah, thank you, Stephanie. And I think that is kind of the backbone to the book, and really, I would always say in starting, my goal in talking about any of this is to make it accessible. So you hear a term like milestones or executive function, and it's probably a cue for a lot of people just to tap out. But I think it's important to recognize that if we can understand how children typically develop overall and how our own child's developing, we can set expectations and kind of meet them where we are in a way that helps them feel much more successful, and often, like you said, helps us with our own frustration level a lot. So one of the ones I think that isn't talked about quite enough yet has to do with this self-management skill set called executive function. And executive function is like the CEO of the brain. So anything that you need to put management to in life probably involves executive function. You have to manage attention and behavior and emotions. And then when you get older, you have to manage projects and manage time and manage social situations. All of which means, that is those are executive function-based tasks. And when you look at it from a child development point of view, you can recognize that is a skill set that begins quite early, and then what we've learned over time matures actually until we're almost 30 years old. And that's important because it means some of the expectations we have for children are sometimes, I think, in the way the world's pushing us nowadays, skewed, so that when kids are pushed beyond really what they're capable of at any point in time, they're not going to get there necessarily right away. So development happens at its own pace, just like with language skills. We wouldn't expect a child to, skip from knowing one or two words to speaking in paragraphs. It all happens at its own pace, and we can do things to build language, and we should be aware of those, but we also can't force it. The same goes for how children manage their lives. And I think that's what I want to I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about in several different ways today.
I really like a quote that you have in the book, that parents are a child's brain manager.
Yeah. And I think I think that's something that gets lost a little bit. And I mean, I should say that, I think we're just being given so much information nowadays in the internet age, and it can just kind of swamp us. But when we recognize that executive function is all of long-term thinking and judgment and planning and time management and impulse control, I think it's important to recognize that we can try to steer our children we should try to steer our children in the right direction, and let them experience, mistakes and find their own way on the one hand. And on the other hand, we really do have to always come back to the fact that we're the mature brain manager in the room. In theory, we have adult level executive function, which means when it comes to things like setting up a useful bedtime routine in younger kids, or discipline across the ages, or even quite acutely for many families, technology in teens, we have to recognize that screens, smartphones are highly, I don't mean the word literal, this is a whole other debate, but they are practically speaking addictive, even if they might not literally be addictive. But they are practically speaking addictive because they're very manipulated. And if you have a teen's level of executive function, that means you might not be able to fully manage that quite yet. And that perspective of allowing children to find their own way when that's appropriate, but where the mature brain manager solves a lot of problems in childhood and tends to make our own lives easier as parents. Because if we're wrestling with a 7-year-old who doesn't know how to manage their homework yet and getting frustrated, like, why don't you manage your homework better? Sometimes the answer is simply to step back and realize, oh, right, they don't have the greatest executive function yet because they're 7 years old. There's no reason to expect them to know how to manage time yet. They're being assigned way more homework than I'd like. So maybe what most needs to happen here is I need to step in and create a routine that works better.
And that gets into also your statement about homework, is that when homework takes over home life, it no longer benefits.
Yeah, there's a lot of things we can't change everything as parents, but I think a lot of the times we have to just look at what's going on in our own houses and see what we can do to help kids the most. So there's certainly a trend in education nowadays to assign way more homework than makes sense from my point of view, and also from the point of view of the research. There isn't a lot of research really showing the benefits of a lot of homework for anyone. But we can't necessarily make that go away in a day either. But one way to make the whole thing go more effective, just to be less stressful, is realizing that on the one hand, certainly we can advocate for less homework when that's possible, but on a more practical level, when we look at executive function, I guess it's useful. I haven't yet today sort of laid it out in sort of step by step, but I think you can look at executive function very quickly as a skill set that bridges different parts of childhood. So that, for example, if you look at executive function across preschool, a lot of that has to do with attention and behavior. By going into preschool, kids are toddlers, and coming out of preschool, they need to be able to manage a classroom. So from an executive function-based point of view, a lot of the milestones they're passing are ones that have to do with attention and impulse control and behavior. And in that age group, one of the most useful things to recognize is that part of executive function is something called the time window, which means the ability to tie your behavior now to anything that happened before or later. And more or less, it doesn't exist at that age. So if you try to manage discipline through, talking kids through problems exclusively, or, telling them just wait till your dad gets home later, wait till your mom gets home later, really in the end, discussion is really important in childhood. I'm not saying don't have those discussions, but from a behavioral point of view, those behaviors aren't going to change because they're wired for just learning through immediate feedback at that age. And then the second stage of executive function development to really be aware of is that, like all of development, this is a bell curve. Some kids can be ahead of it and some kids can be behind it. But when you think about managing tasks and projects and schoolwork, that's something that begins just as beginning in kindergarten, first grade. There's almost no ability to do that initially. And then by 8th grade or 8th or 9th grade needs to be able to manage whatever is expected of a child in high school. And that means in early elementary school, if your child is always procrastinating and doesn't get their homework done and forgets to hand it in and does all these things, separate from any discussion of having, any particular, disorders or learning disabilities, sometimes that's simply how a child approaches life at that age. They don't have strong executive function. And one of the ways they will learn it is from the routines we create. It's kind of like teaching them to ride a bicycle. Some kids, I suppose, might pick up a bicycle and figure it out on their own. Most of them are going to need us to teach them the basics and support them a lot. And eventually, they ride on their own. And that's how study skills work and time management works and all these routines in early childhood. And so the expectation that a child is going to be able to just sort of do that isn't always realistic. I think in middle school, one of the most practical things that gets missed, for example, is that learning how to study is an executive function based skill. Mm-hmm. So that just setting up a school year as a teacher or a parent, by realizing that a lot of kids don't know how to study yet, they often look unmotivated because they just don't know what to do, can set up a whole school year for success, just setting up that routine. And then sort of the last huge step in executive function we could talk about today is the one between start of high school and adulthood. Recognizing that teens want to be independent and they look like young adults, and many of them are way ahead of the curve and can be, holding complex jobs and all sorts of, we all know people have done amazing things as teens, but the average teenager is 10 years away from having mature, judgment, planning, time management skills, making, useful choices, managing their sleep. All of those things, they deserve an opportunity, and you let your own child run with it as long as they show themselves capable. And the way we parent has to change once we have teenagers, perhaps. But we do need to keep track of the fact that we're the brain manager in the room. Like sometimes we just have a much more mature perspective on things.
Right. And also that setting limits, as you mentioned, isn't a fun thing to do, but it's also something that kids crave. They need clear limits. And I like that you also say, you need to also pair that with emotional warmth. You don't have to go one way or the other. You can combine
right.
these.
I think so much of parenting, sometimes when I try to pull all this together in a way, my goal is always to simplify life for people. It's kind of like the modern science of back to the basics parenting. It's just recognizing that people sell us and package all these really extreme answers that are going to fix everything and change everything, and anything that extreme is rarely true. So when it comes to just parenting style, for example, of course there's no one way to raise children. We can take care of parents other ways. But you're right. On the one hand, certainly children, really require a sense of warmth and being, supported positively, and a healthy relationship and fun times together is foundational to a healthy childhood. But we can't, go into it expecting that children aren't going to need limits and run into frustration, and that there are times we just have to flat out say no. And books that suggest that we can meet all our children's needs or raise them in a way that they're never fussy or upset miss typical child development to me. And I think the way to look at limit setting and the frustrations kids set is that they're really, and I say this carefully, within the context of a happy, healthy relationship, a safe and warm home, they're not really disciplined as much as they're educational. The capacity to be frustrated and learn to manage frustration, if it's not happening all the time, but it's just happening sometimes in a healthy home, that's an important skill to pick up in life. Or the routines we create that might feel like limit setting, like maybe having something simple like a electronics bedtime at home, even though all your friends don't have one. That's a limit that teaches an important habit in life, and it's okay if it frustrates kids, or if they get in trouble for misbehaving when they're younger. That's okay. As long as it's not a lifestyle, it's okay. It's actually part of, it's a way of learning how to manage life.
Right. Especially when you say too, with play helps kids figure out how to resolve disputes.
Right. And that's again, and we're being pulled and pushed so many different ways to schedule kids more and more, even at really young ages, to teach them academically in early childhood. But I think we have to look at the fact that free play itself probably evolved for two reasons. One is to help them manage like you said, open-ended play with peers is a way they learn to manage social situations. Although with that same sense of and sometimes adults need to step in and help them out. Mm-hmm. And that really, from an evolutionary point of view, one of the reasons play evolved is simply to build executive function and self-management skills. So it turns out that strong early childhood self-management skills correlate with success all the way through schooling, which is, if we have time, we can touch on that a little bit. So when you measure, which kids seem ahead of the curve on executive function in preschool, controlling for nothing else, just based on that one-time measure, you can show that overall they tend to do better all the way through adulthood, which is an incredible statement. And in early child in particular, one of the most important things for children to do to develop those skills is just play. Just open-ended play, not overly structured, by adults. Structured in a safe way, but not not with adults leading the way the whole way. Helps children develop self-management skills. And there's some research that suggests, for example, that kids who go through what are often called developmental preschools that emphasize play, outperform kids who go through academic preschools by second grade. Because this is coming back to where we started today, like understanding that we need to be patient in early childhood sometimes, that the main thing preschoolers need to be learning from a behavioral, from an emotional point of view is just, self-management skills, not necessarily how to write and spell and everything else yet. Certainly, if an individual child is ready for it, run with it. But for many kids at that age, really, they're just ready for play. There's even some research that says that overly academic kindergartens lead to misdiagnosis of ADHD because the expectations are off. Some kindergartners are still transitioning out of that play-based stage of life. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of, there's other things we could do to build academic skills that are developmentally appropriate in preschool, but we can't push kids to develop quicker than they are developing, in essence.
Right, and you have a whole chapter on when should you kind of perk your ears up or get a consult when kids maybe are, we have desynchronous development where kids aren't going to be with their peers sometimes, but if you could speak a little bit more to when should parents maybe seek the consult of a developmental pediatrician or a psychologist? When is it an intuition thing with parenting?
I think it's a little more complicated than that because it's so emotionally charged. It's hard to know. I think, first of all, if we're going to talk about supports in this age, around this topic, I think we haven't said yet that certainly the most practical way to look at executive function is that just like some kids could be delayed in language skills and have language delays, or if they have severe social skills, you might be worried about something like autism. When it comes to executive function on a practical level, children who are significantly behind typically turn out to have ADHD. So ADHD is kind of long outgrown its name. I think the best way to understand it as a parent is a delay in executive function. With that same perspective we would take towards a language delay. Like they can't help it and we're not happy about it in any way, but we also don't blame them for it. So really, I think there are two or three reasons really to step in and ask someone to get an evaluation done. Not the least of which is if you're just not sure, the uncertainty itself is exhausting. So evaluations, I think, are often emotionally tied to treatment when it comes to ADHD. Like people are worried that if they seek evaluation early, they're going to commit to certain treatments they don't want to do. But initially, it's really just to understand what's going on. So one reason to get an evaluation all on its own, I think, is if it's just too much time with too many people suggesting something might be going on, there's a lot of value to trying to cut through the uncertainty. And then from a child's point of view, a lot of the interventions aren't medical anyway. They're really educational. So from a child's point of view, they are going to benefit hugely if you can just get a sense of why they're having difficulty. So if there's an ongoing pattern of some challenge socially or in the classroom or at home, it's worth trying to understand the why of it. That often changes things a ton. I hear quite often, that the tone at home shifts just at the moment you understand what's going on. So I had someone recently I saw who she came back really just a week later. We hadn't even done anything yet. And she thanked me because things were better at home. And I was kind of surprised, honestly. And she just said, I just stopped blaming him for being impulsive. Like now, and then she said, like, now what do we do? Now what do we do about it? But she realized that it was part of his developmental delay. And she just took, she felt like they'd had a better week just because, it was still difficult because he was impulsive, but she wasn't as, fearful and charged up around, why is he being so impulsive? He's being impulsive because he has, an executive function disorder.
So now she's being able to move into action.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And it changed the emotional tone of things, and then she can move into action because, obviously that's the third piece is the sooner you can have a clear view of why someone's behind, the sooner you can intervene, the sooner they'll catch up. And that's, really the heart of my whole field is, whatever topic you're talking about, just back from a conference on dyslexia and learning disabilities, and even, same idea. People are pushing for earlier and earlier screening tools to pick up learning disabilities, because the sooner you intervene, the sooner children catch up. And certainly that's true about executive function too.
And you're talking too about in preschools, and I like that you call it not ready for primetime preschool. That what are some things that people can do? I think you mentioned that there's that red, yellow, green light, where you have kids stop and go.
Yeah, I mean, red light, green light is just an example of one. I mean, one of many types of play. I mean, I think the thing to think about in preschool is not to overthink it. I mean, the thing to think about in preschool is that really what most builds executive function is open-ended, unplugged play. Mm-hmm. And that can mean lots of different things for lots of different families. So you don't want to tie yourself in a knot trying to play red light, green light if your child doesn't like red light, green light.
Right.
It's more about just recognizing that, sort of unstructured play, certainly without a screen, we can talk about that too, is really what drives the development of executive function in the age group. And lots of imaginative play does, and you can do little things like, if your child's willing, you can, little games like switching perspective during imaginative play, or changing the rules during red light, green light in a fun way. All these things accumulate to help build executive function. I think the more important thing is realizing that in the modern world, with all the pressures we have and with the impact of screens, we need to, sort of assertively protect that time or it goes away. I'd be sort of remiss if I didn't mention that, if I had to pick a second traditional activity that most sets kids up for school success from a research point of view, it's just tons of exposure to reading, language, and books. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that kids pick up a lot more language and knowledge from interactions with people and books than they do through supposedly educational programming. So that's the environment children, most benefit from when it comes to schooling early on.
And what would you say to parents that, let's say they're working 2 jobs and they come home and kids are having to do homework on their own? What's something that parents can do when they get home from work to kind of help that piece of language and reading if they have a short amount of time? Let's say, for instance, a single parent with not a lot of support. What's a way that they could help their kids?
Well, you mentioned 2 different things there, so I'm not. It's hard to say. It's a really broad question because of age.
Okay, so let me say, let's say 3rd to 5th grade.
You're right. So in elementary school, I think there's 2 or 3 things that any parent can do. And that's, again, I hope to, all of these things are accessible to anybody. Mm-hmm. One is if somebody is in a caretaking role at that moment, and one of the simplest things to do around homework is realize that one aspect, the kind of organizational planning aspect of executive function is learned a lot through routine. And some of us as adults aren't really into routine, but we just have to recognize once, it's like that's a good opportunity to kind of pause and think, but, how would I advise a best friend? Like, what would be most useful for my child right now? So one aspect of it is that even if you're not going to be the point person there for homework, recognizing that just building a structured routine that eventually becomes habit goes a long way to setting kids up for school success. And then you can add little pieces that have to do with studying and time management as they get older. Sometimes it's not like this just happens because you say so. That's mm-hmm. the hard part of being a parent. So sometimes you have to sort of fold that into a behavioral routine. So one of the more common ones nowadays, if children, most children get some screen time during the week nowadays, for better or worse. And, really just to make it's like an exercise in prioritization. If you do your homework at this time with a good attitude in this way, then you've earned your screen time, and otherwise you have not earned your screen time. Eventually those homework habits become just totally internalized. The flip side of it is just in terms of encouraging reading, again, and this is even if you're out of the house, being the mature brain manager means doing your best to set up a household that supports some of these things. And again, you have to let go with nothing. There's no perfect to any of this. It's all about just doing the best we can. Parenting isn't perfect by any means. But screen limits are important because kids can't manage screen time. Most kids can't manage screen time on their own. It's a highly, it's designed to suck in your attention. The type of attention kids play with on a screen is actually a very jagged, rapidly moving type of attention. That's why it seems fun. So they look like, or it is fun, but it's fun if we play them too, but it's because of the type of attention you're giving to it. It's not really demanding. It's all about novelty seeking and shifting attention. And it doesn't, so it looks like attention from the outside because you're kind of nailed to your chair, but it's not sustained attention really for most activities. It's just a tool. I think I've come out too negative here about it. I mean, technology is just a tool. It's about using it well and not getting used by it.
Right, and the moderation of it, I think, is the key piece there.
The key piece is that parents have to moderate it. Kids can't. They have immature brain managers. And there's research saying that strong moderation of screen time all on its own leads to better academic, social, and behavioral performance in kids. So we just have to drop the illusion that most kids are going to make healthy choices around their phones until they show us they can, kind of like teaching them to drive a car. So you just got to know your child. But most kids need parents to really define what healthy use looks like, and that will learn from living within that routine. And then that begins to accumulate because when it's, again, this is to me kind of intuitive, but also research backed, which is when we set limits, kids start playing differently. So their imaginative and free play time changes. They read more, which is one of the most fundamentally important things for children to be doing. There's something called the Matthew effect, which is that I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but broadly speaking, a strong reader will read as much over several days in childhood if they're reading at home than as someone who is a weak reader will read over like a year. I mean, it's a startling number, and over time, that gives them an incredible leg up at home. In school. And it's that, battle of we can't force anyone into becoming a reader, but we can create an environment that makes it more likely that that's an activity they want to do. And of course, screen time cuts into reading time. So that, if we want to protect all these healthier activities and let them develop naturally, it's like you can't force them. There's games you can play, like reward plans and things, but mostly you just want reading to eventually become fun on its own. And that's only going to happen if we teach kids well so that they become strong readers. And then we set up a family environment that just has enough space for, reading to become part of it. And there's a lot more to do to encourage reading, but broadly speaking, that's what we're talking about.
I think that also ties into your citation of research that says 70% of kids feel that parents have too much screen time.
Oh, screen time, it's hard to talk about it briefly. I think the short of it is that unlike a lot of other cultural changes that have happened over the years, there's a ton of research already that says that when we don't moderate screen time, it has an adverse effect on all of us. And there's a little bit of a kickback finally starting. Like, for example, there's a group called the Center for Humane Technology that are some insiders from, the social media world that are trying to kind of undo what they did, because everything about smartphones and technology is driven by really intensively successful behavioral psychology. I mean, it's like slot machines. It's like really, we get really sucked in. And that goes for adults as much as kids. So when you talk about setting up a home environment, we need to recognize the impact of our own use and the fact that as adults, we're often being sucked into our phones at times we probably wouldn't if we stopped and thought about it, or in ways that are disruptive. If we want our children to grow up in a particular way, it's much more likely to happen if we live that way too. Plus, when it comes to the basics of relationship and attachment, screens have been shown to disrupt conversations, shorten conversations, change how, people play. So it's a really simple thing we can do at home is just to put away our phones when we're with our kids, because it helps our relationships with our kids and because it also, models what we want to be modeling too. So a lot of teaching kids to manage technology well starts with re-examining how we're living with it, because it's really distracting for a lot of us a lot of the time, unless we're pretty assertive about planning what's healthy. And then the second part of it is guiding our children. It really comes back to where we started today a little bit. I mean, limits that word of setting limits has become almost like this really charged word in our culture right now, our parenting culture, when in reality, they're just part of being a parent. I mean, we're the grown-ups and they're not, and we should let them find their own limits when they can. So it's absolutely, I don't mean being oppressive in any way, manner, or form. I mean, you let children find their own way, and then you set parameters, you set boundaries, like you let them try, and then there's an outside of what's okay. And then for some things, as I'm saying that, I'm thinking like that's actually not exactly what I always recommend around screens, because around screens, the other useful thing to realize is that we can actually, the earlier we start setting just reasonable boundaries about it, what's actually often simpler it's like driving a car. It's like we set a fair amount of limits at first, and then if someone shows they're capable of managing that situation well, we expand and open it up and sort of move from teaching them to drive to a learner's permit to driving a car. And technology is the same. There's a group starting in the country now called Wait Till Eighth, which is aiming to get parents kind of as a whole to agree not to give smartphones to anyone under 13. Wow. And there's stuff like that going on that I think is very healthy. And even then, as parents, we just have to realize that, if you have a child younger than 13 who you feel like needs a device for some reason, then the first step to do is give them a device that's just shut down in every way, matter if they're that young, that everything's shut off except what you think that is appropriate access for them. And then if that seems healthy, you start expanding more gradually over time.
Could it be also with a device that they're just mimicking what parents are doing, and so it's kind of like giving kids a play phone? Is it more?
It's both. Okay. It's entirely both. I mean, it starts with again, if we're on our phone all the time, we're taking out our phone at a restaurant at the table, our kids are going to do that too. So it's not either or, it's both. So we have to re-examine how we're living with technology. And there's lots of, we could spend the next hour. There's many, many things we could do that sort of, help make that break cleaner, because, it affects adults as much as it affects kids. And then kids, because, need our assistance just to grow up healthy, to grow up in a balanced way. It's like, to me, it's like the nutrition plate. It's like a little bit of this and a little bit of that is healthy for brain development, just like it is for eating.
Right. And that ties into, too, the screen use when you speak about practicing good self-care as a parent and how essential that is.
Yeah, and I do think that's something that, I work with physicians a lot, too, and, teachers and, anyone who's in a caretaking role. It's really easy when life gets busy and pressured and you want nothing more than the kids or if you're a physician, the people you're working with to thrive. It's so easy to just get caught up in it all, and people are making requests in you and you're being pulled. There's research saying that just the connectivity of being available 24/7 is a new stress on parents that is real. But the reality in life is somewhere in the middle of all that, our kids will benefit if we take a little bit of time for our own resilience, if we take a little bit of time for our own self-care. We need to value that too, because no one can continue at full throttle indefinitely. It's just, we're never going to be at our best then. Our kids don't benefit. If we're stressed and exhausted, we're not going to be at our best, which is clearly going to impact our kids. So as we examine how we're living, or just look at the average week, finding those moments to do something that helps us feel more grounded and together is really not an act of selfishness in any way. It's really one way to sort of show our love for our children. It's we need to hold it together as best as we're able to, and sort of letting go of perfectionism and maybe even dropping this picture of like working out has to look like this, or I have to behave like this all the time, or I have to be available all the time. And trying to carve out just a few minutes for the people who make us feel stronger, or the activities that make us feel stronger. Or certainly for me, one of the threads that has made this topic of executive function so important to me, personally, honestly, but also professionally, is that kind of the flip side of some of these things that get in the way of executive function is that from a research point of view, the practice of mindfulness is one of the things that most directly builds executive function. So that those could be the few minutes we spend Of course, letting go of perfectionism there too, because mindfulness doesn't mean we're going to be perfectly relaxed and calm all the time. It's more just like hitting the gym. It just is a recognition that life is inherently unsettling and at times, and if we can practice certain skills regularly, it just becomes easier to navigate that. So it doesn't mean we're going to practice mindfulness in some perfect way either. It just is a recognition that it is a skill. This sort of whole idea of managing our lives is something we can work on. So whatever it's going to be, that's, if that works for you, great. I think it's extremely helpful for me and for people I've worked with, but it's not specifically about that as much as just valuing self-care and the whole mix of things.
And I really like your example of the inner critic of parenting. You describe Statler and Waldorf, the Muppet Show balcony. And I think that's a great way to describe it. You've got this constant self-talk in your head, and the idea that there's no way to be a perfect parent, but there are a million ways to be a great parent. And
absolutely, go ahead. Sorry.
And I was thinking one of those ways is practicing mindfulness, and you actually give specific ways that parents can do that. And with the idea being that mindfulness, it can sound esoteric sometimes to people, but it's basically staying in the here and now.
Yeah, well, it is a little bit of that, and although honestly, I think. And I've known you long enough that I'll call you on it. I might not. It's like, I don't even like those types of cliches. I mean, being in the here and now sounds like...
And I knew that, and I said it anyway, Mark.
Yeah, I know, because it's not... the most important thing about mindfulness is that it's meant to be just practical and accessible. I mean, the reality of it is we all get distracted. When we're distracted and not paying attention to what we're doing, we can't make active choices. We sort of fall back on habits and reactivity. So even the idea, that cliche of being in the here and now, is a practical one. I mean, we can't, really make sure we're, managing a difficult situation as well as we can if we're not giving our attention to it. Or the flip side is so often in life we just get caught up in, there's something called the negativity bias, which is like that inner critic, which is, the unpleasant, difficult things in life just hold our attention much more strongly than everything else. And sort of actively combating that so that we can spend some, positive time with our kids without being all caught up in the fact that homework isn't going well, or that that we got in a fight with our spouse or something at work. And so a lot of practicing mindfulness is just working with just the habits we fall into mentally that make our lives more difficult. So, you kind of want to blow through the cliches and forget the fact that it's having its little pop moment in the sun, and realize, like, anybody anywhere could work on just staying more settled when we're rattled, or more often catching our attention and giving it fully to what we're doing. There's some research that suggests that just the ability to pay attention to what's going on in front of us, whether or not it's pleasant or unpleasant, increases our overall sense of well-being. And there's, teasing that, why that is a long discussion, but a lot of it has to do with, we fall into these mental habits that just cognitively, mentally make ourselves, just sort of add on misery to already difficult situations. So a lot of mindfulness practice is making it real and useful for yourself, without getting caught up in all the perfectionism. And even something like the inner critic is, it's like this ingrained habitual voice that goes probably back to childhood for most of us in some way or another. But it's totally irrational. We can get so caught up in pushing ourselves and trying to sort of convince ourselves that Waldorf and Statler are, we're trying to prove them wrong, when in the end, they're just going to keep spouting. And for anyone who doesn't remember, those are the two old guys from the Muppet Show who sat up in the balcony and just heckled endlessly. And they're just going to keep endlessly heckling no matter what goes on stage. And just beginning to sort of create some space and not get caught up in that type of thinking. You might not be able to eliminate it completely, but you can recognize it for what it is, and then kind of try to give yourself the advice you give a best friend in the same situation of like, yeah, I can hear that, you're criticizing yourself right now, but you did the best you could, all right, didn't go as well as you could. What comes next, and really try to shift that perspective. And again, there's a psychological construct around that. A lot of research shows that when we can get past those, that when we can work with that inner critical voice and sort of learn to relate to it in a healthier way, it kind of paradoxically actually increases our motivation. A lot of people feel like their perfectionism is their motivation, but actually you can be really motivated without setting an unrealistic standard for yourself. And the research says you'll not only feel better about it, you'll probably, in the end, be more motivated, more flexible in your problem solving, and then it eventually also changes how you treat other people. So there's a lot of benefit to beginning to notice and work with that sort of inner critic.
Right, and I think also that I think we find that there is that paradoxical effect that when you stop working so hard at being a good parent, that sometimes things just fall naturally into place because of that healthy relationship you have with your kid.
Oh, I think so much. I mean, there's a, I think it's not only in parenting, but so often when we sort of pause long enough to sort of check in with what's going on, a lot of what helps us find solid ground is letting go. It's like all this stuff that we get caught up in, and we let go of a lot of unrealistic stuff or a lot of difficult mental habits, and it's not so easy to do. But as we do it, it sort of comes back to play. We can easily get caught up in we need to schedule this class and that class and early academics and this, that, and the other thing, and just pausing and sort of checking in with what really builds resilience in kids. Well, it's healthy relationships and focusing on self-management skills and helping them believe in their own sense of self-efficacy and effort. And then the rest of it, isn't necessarily useful. So in a lot of different places in life, one of the reasons I think this approach to parenting is so helpful is, on the one hand, it's the practical answer to many, many things, and just realizing right, children aren't necessarily going to develop their own a sleep routine in their best interest until they have that perspective, that they can build a routine and that they care about sleep that way. And then the other end of it is in sort of setting our children up to be resilient and successful. We can't control their whole future, but we can focus on the foundational skills that help them become resilient. And that often means just letting go of a lot of the extra, trusting in the basics, trusting in ourselves, and just focusing on the fact that if we have a solid relationship and we're consistent in some of the things that build self-management skills, and we help them, develop a sense of their own strengths, that's what's going to set them up for success. And we don't really need to get caught up in all the rest.
Right. And you mentioned too in the book that when you have a kid that's in sports and doing all this academic stuff and volunteer hours, and we're looking at, wow, they're so overscheduled, we need to look at what the origin of that overscheduling is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and sometimes we have to do it on a practical level and just look at, there only are so many hours of the day, and it can be useful sometimes to actually, put on paper what we're asking of them or asking of ourselves, because something as simple, I've mentioned sleep a couple of times, so I might as well come back to it. I think our whole culture sometimes gets caught up in not really valuing sleep. School start times are way too early, all that kind of stuff. And yet our body requires sleep. It doesn't take that many days of sleep for it to start affecting how we think. And so maybe at the start of a new school year, or if it feels like things are out of control, sometimes we just need to look at it on a practical level and pause and just sort of draw on paper. I said, see, that's a mindfulness cliche I've used too many times today. It's like pausing is not so easy, but I don't mean it, it doesn't mean pause specifically as much as just like take stock, check in, make sure we're not just living on autopilot, whatever word you want to use for it. But when it comes to scheduling for older kids, sometimes you need to really just draw it on paper. How many hours of sleep do you think you need to function at your best? And how many hours of homework are you doing? And how many school hours do you have? And even older kids need some family time, or I would really value family time, and they need free time and play time. And you almost have to draw it on a calendar to say, like, wow, that's maybe one more activity that's possible this semester. And then in younger kids, the same activity sometimes leads you to a sense of, if you start from the premise that in early childhood, they just need free play and social time. Sometimes when you look at it on that practical level, you can just block out that open-ended time first, and then start figuring out, how many art classes and music classes and sports are possible.
And I want to ask a little bit about also that 10-minute, so let me back up a little bit, but you cite the National Education Association. I believe also the American Academy of Pediatrics. I might not be totally correct, but they have stated that 10 minutes max per grade of the child is appropriate for homework and no more than that. If you could speak a little bit to what can parents do?
That's such a difficult topic, because this is one of those situations where obviously not everything is under our control. So, but I do think I mentioned this a while back. I think when it comes to homework, there is a general recommendation for no more than 10 minutes per grade. And by the way, if you do the math on that, you can consider kindergarten year zero. So 0 times 10 is zero. It's like that recommendation means a little bit of homework starting in first grade. And then the value of homework, if as much as there is any, is in reinforcing classroom learning. So you need some repetition to memorize and learn, various things all the way through schooling, and to teach good habits. So you need to learn how to study and manage time, and that's it. So, but as a parent, we can't necessarily change our school policies. So I think there are 2 or 3 things parents can do, but I do think we touched on them earlier. I mean, one is that there is a lot of room for advocacy. I know from talking to superintendents that a lot of superintendents believe in the need to cut back on homework, but find that many of the parents in their districts are still caught up in believing that lots of homework sets kids up for college success.
Oh, it's interesting. So it's actually the parents that they say don't want to back up.
Correct. I mean, a lot of there's different situations, but a lot of superintendents I've talked to find that there are just a lot of parents who still, have that kind of old school belief that that's true, but it isn't. I also think it's kind of a failure of math in essence, because the assumption, a college workload is based on the fact that there tends to be a lot less class time in most majors. So the assumption in college is there's more hours of outside of class work per hour inside of class. And that's the assumption when you hit college. In high school, you tend to be really, really structured and scheduled, which is appropriate at that age. But it also means that if you then sort of take that college level workload and stick it into high school, there's no time for it. It doesn't, it starts intruding on a lot of other health. But I do think at a more practical level as parents, the things you can do are recognize that many high schoolers have relatively immature executive function. So some of it has to do with just on a practical level, helping them with managing time and planning and sometimes they need our help not to get caught up in overscheduling and picking another activity. So some of it has to do with helping as the brain manager them handle the logistics of it. And some of it sometimes has to do with recognizing throughout schooling that since what's going on at home is really only supposed to reinforce the classroom, that it's okay if homework seems too hard sometimes to just send it back. It really is the school's responsibility to make sure homework is appropriate. So instead of getting overly caught up in making sure their homework is pristine at home and teaching at home and getting really overly involved at home, there are definitely situations where the right answer is to say, okay, my child doesn't really know how to do this yet, and in a polite way, send it back to the school and ask them to either teach them how to do it differently or modify the homework.
And I think that's something worth repeating, that if your child is doing homework and it's skills that the child has not learned yet, that it's acceptable to turn the homework back in and say, and again, I think you say this in a nice way, my child doesn't have these skills yet, would you mind going over them, or something to that effect. I think that's very important to say that parents do have leeway and they do have rights and can advocate for their kid in that way.
Absolutely. And again, to come back again to one other thing we said earlier, it's another reason why early evaluation is so important, because certainly for a child who has a chronic difficulty in either a specific academic subject or around executive function, one of the things you gain from the evaluation are school supports, and those school supports frequently can include homework modification.
Yes, exactly. And that's what you go through when you do your 504 IEP meeting, that you can request a reduction in homework.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I was going to add too, with the screen time, Apple now has on their iPhones a screen time app where you can actually plug in what's your maximum amount of time you want to spend on certain apps.
Well, it's true. I mean, Apple finally got around to doing it.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's a little late, but if parents are looking for a kind of a baby step.
Right. But I was going to say, though, is that there have been programs that do that for many, many years, and there's some adults who need this. So, it's not, again, it doesn't need to be, it all has to do with how we frame these things. It doesn't, I mean, obviously there can be a very emotionally charged situation when it comes to phones and kids, but there are many, many programs and devices and products that will let you do things like, shut off everything during your productive work time. Adults use these too.
Yeah, I was actually meaning the screen time thing for parents.
Right, no, they have it. There's many of them. And so you can set, you could shut everything down for yourself so the notifications don't distract you during work time. You can just make it a guidance during homework time. And the intention, and I don't mean to oversimplify it. I mean, the behavioral side of it can be really difficult, but the intention, especially if you start in very early childhood, I think, that's the biggest, for parents of listening whose kids are really young, all these things just become routine if that's how kids are raised. So if you, right from the beginning of school, just make it a routine that there is no technology around except what you're working with. I mean, lots of kids have to be on their laptop and stuff, but we shut off everything except the work. And you start teaching kids that from first grade, maybe, that's an educational point. And the flip side is if you need to, or if you can get there in discussion, you might work with a high schooler and say, like, look, I do this. I mean, this is, it's really distracting. You're, all these. So we're going to start using this program that just for a couple hours pauses all the distractions. And it isn't just, I mean, Apple has it. There's many Android products that do it. Windows has ways to do it. There are programs you can add. I mean, the most important thing to know is that is to just know all that stuff is out there, because there's a reason those are things that are not coming bundled on our phones. There's a lot of stuff that has to, that comes on our phones because that's the stuff, those are the people paying them to, arrive plugged in. And yet one way to set up any device to be more useful is to take away the ones you don't need and then put on the stuff that helps you feel more in control of the situation.
And your cell phone service provider can even shut off data service to particular phones on your plan between certain hours or days of the week. So that's another option too.
Yeah, there are lots and lots of ways to do this if you want to or need to.
Yeah, and I'm with you that we're giving kids phones way too early. And again, that's another hour podcast about that.
Well, it's, I would say on the one hand, it's an hour of podcast. On the other hand, it does directly relate to what we're talking about today. I mean, it's not a bunch of adults being old farts to say that. It's understanding executive function. Right. Your ability to manage life in terms of attention and planning and prioritization and organization is maturing until you're almost 25. The expectation that anyone really young would manage their phone, totally well is challenging for many kids. So, and you don't want kids who just fill all their free time with their phones either. So, to create balance in early childhood, almost by definition, from a developmental point of view, requires adult instruction and guidance.
And you mentioned too in the book that screen time is a privilege, not a right for kids.
Yeah, and that's obviously not how they feel about it quite often, but it's an important perspective for us to have, is that again, I think the simplest way to picture that to me is it's like the car keys. If you don't drive my car safely, then you can't drive my car. And around screen time, and there's new, kids need to, this is how they plug in socially nowadays for sure. And even there, older kids, I mean, not younger ones, that technology is just a tool. You can use it well, you can use it poorly, until you show if you're using it well, by all means, keep using it, and that means using it in a balanced way and not being inappropriate online and whatever else it means, and not keeping yourself up all night. But it is a privilege. And, one thing I've seen things written about how, you can never disconnect kids from their social media, and certainly because that's where their social network is. And certainly, you have to know your own child. So I'm not saying, there might not be a situation where what I'm about to say is false, but, on the one hand, from a research point of view, we know that more social media time actually correlates with a sense of increasing isolation and puts teens at risk for depression. So they're often not doing what's in their best interest anyway. And on the other hand, most of us have been grounded at least once in life, so that as long as we don't make them disconnect forever, I personally think it's kind of routine to say, like, because of that, you're losing access for a day. As long as we don't completely shut them off from their social world, in most situations, and again, use sound judgment in your own individual house, but in most situations, that's that sense of, like, you have to do this responsibly. You can't be, doing inappropriate things or treating yourself poorly in that way.
And I think it's also important to point out too that your kids are not going to like you all the time. If your kids like you all the time, you may need to start setting some better limits.
Yeah. As parents, we're just, Wendy Mogul's a brilliant, I don't recommend a lot of parenting books, but I think they tend to overwhelm. There's just too many out there in essence. And that's coming from someone who's sitting here talking about one. But Wendy talks about, when she talks about teens, she has a book called The Blessing of a B-, that, we have to do all the positive things that build a relationship, but that's like money in the bank. That's just like building and building and building all the things that create this foundation of a healthy, warm home, because there just have to be times that kids bounce up against limits, and they're relying us to set those limits, even if they can't say it. Even teens, there are just moments where they may look like they're just pushing and pushing and pushing, but part of our job is to keep them safe by eventually saying, no, you need to come home, or no, you can't go do that.
Right. And kids actually like that, even though they may act like they don't like it.
Right. Right. And they might not even be able to say why they're relying on it in that moment, because they're caught up in so many other things and they're emotional and everything else. But the reality is they are relying on it.
And that sometimes your kids are going to tell you they don't like you, or that they even hate you. And that's okay.
Right. I mean, most of the time, you can almost notice when kids say that, it's like, we all, when we're really angry, spout off in different ways, or most of us do, and those momentary statements are, typically they're an expression of like, I'm really angry at you right now. They're just trying to find the most difficult way to say it. Right.
And also executive function issues, because your executive functions aren't developed. As a kid, you're not really thinking through what the best words are to use. So it's not a personal thing.
It's not personal anyway. I mean, not, both with ADHD specifically and with executive function as a whole, I don't think there's always enough emphasis on recognizing that managing emotions is inherently part of it.
Right.
So that, being emotionally reactive is part of the picture for most people who are, who are struggling with executive function in one way or the other, except that that's also part of typical development.
Right. So if you could leave parents with a piece of advice or pieces of advice before we close today, what would you recommend to them?
I think, I think often the most important thing is trusting that if you can take a look at how you're living, make choices based on just educating yourself about what matters to you, and focus on these foundational steps towards resilience, towards helping children manage their own life over time, that really you're going to find you're able to, you and your child are going to feel much more successful and less stressed day to day. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is come back to whatever the core, the core that you want to focus on at home in terms of how you want to live and what you want to prioritize. And then quite often letting go of all the rest is what's going to help your children and you feel much more resilient and happy over time. And I think that's really the heart of it.
And I really like the quote you have in the book, is that what's truly important is enjoying your family.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it always comes down to in the end. So thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm going to repeat the name of your book again. And again, I recommend this to every parent. How Children Thrive, the Practical Science of Raising Independent, Resilient, and Happy Kids. So thanks so much, Mark. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'll see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again for listening to Talking Brains podcast. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And also, if you like the podcast, give us a rating. We appreciate that. And this is Dr. Stephanie Sarkis, and you can find me at stephaniesarkis.com. Thank you.